Have you ever noticed how some words have more to do with bad human behavior and they're more acceptable and tolerable than others? Well, we can hear the word anger, we can hear the word fear or depression or even the word rejection, and most people will admit, oh yeah, I have a bout with that every so often. That's a problem. Most people will admit that, but there's one behavioral emotion now that no one likes to admit. They don't ever want to admit to it. See if I'm not right. Is there anyone who has not been a little bit offended when you've been accused now of being in self-pity? Sometimes we just feel like we want to wallop somebody when they make a comment and say, oh, well, you're just having a pity party, or you're just feeling sorry for yourself. Everything in our being wants to scream back and say, no, I am not having a pity party. That's our immediate reaction, because no one likes to be accused of self-pity. Now, when Jack and I first started dating, we had this elderly uncle named Hugo. And Hugo would have been a textbook example of a classic case now of extreme self-pity. I'm not talking about self-pity, I'm talking about extreme self-pity. Rejection and self-rejection, now they're cousins to self-pity. And Hugo would spend half of his time thinking that he was being rejected, and he would spend the other half of his time rejecting himself. It was really sad. And all of that was bound up in a constant state now of just self-pity all the time. Now, self-pity is like a magnet because it literally will draw things in the spiritual realm. It draws to them to go wrong. And it makes a person feel sorry for themselves. Now, when I was thinking of Hugo, I couldn't help but remember one episode that would have made a slapstick comedy movie without even having to do a rehearsal. Hugo worked for Jack's dad, who owned the Pepsi bottling company. And Hugo had absolutely no common sense. He really didn't, And Hugo was the older brother, so he felt a little put down for having to answer to his little brother. That kind of was a real slap in his face. Well, Mr. Ruth leaned real heavily on his son Jack, and Hugo would get his feelings hurt because he felt like no one would let him be in on any of the decision making, and so he just had his feelings hurt most of the time. Well, that always made him then feel sorry for himself. So one day, Jack and his dad were out of the Pepsi plant. They had gone off somewhere together, and a liquid soap salesman came through, and Hugo took it upon himself now to buy a 55-gallon barrel of liquid soap, hand soap. Now, that was enough hand soap to last until the rapture, and that was back before the days of soap dispensers. And so what he would do, they didn't know what to do with it when they came back. They said, what are you thinking? So what he did, he lived by himself, and I think he ate a lot of cans of beans. And so he saved off all of his bean cans, and he washed them all out. And he filled them full of his liquid soap, and he had one by the lavatory. He had one of the liquid soap cans by the tire rack, and he had one in all the restrooms and even by the drinking fountain, And so the employees hated it because they were working on machinery all the time, and they would dip their hands, had a lot of grease on their hands, and that black grease now from their hands would get into that pink soap, and so it just all of a sudden the can looked nasty and goopy, and so they didn't want to use it because it looked so bad. So that meant that Hugo's always having to clean out those soap cans and put out new ones. And everybody teased him. Everybody referred to it as Hugo's soap. Well, they had been using that stuff for several years, and all of a sudden the barrel started rusting out at the bottom. So you can imagine that floor started getting real sticky and messy when they tried to walk in it, and it was a horrible mess. Well, that was also back before the days of throwaway bottles. Back then, you'd pay a deposit on a glass bottle, and then you would return it later, and the plant would take those returnable glass bottles, and they would put them through this huge bottle washer. Now, when I say a huge bottle washer, the washer was about 5 feet wide, it was 10 feet tall, and it was 30 feet long. So we're talking about, it was a huge room anyway, but it filled up the room. It was a huge piece of machinery. Well, one day when no one was looking, Hugo decided that he would pour the rest of that liquid hand soap into that bottle washer, and he'd get rid of it. And then once and for all, it'd be over with. And so he didn't think anyone would ever know. Well, now, of course, they made a special soap for those washers that didn't make soap suds. And so it's kind of like what they make for dishwashers today. It didn't have a lot of soap bubbles, you know. Well, this particular day, everything was fine, and until the high-pressure pump agitator came on. And when it did, soap bubbles began to come out of every crack and crevice of that huge machinery. I mean, it was coming out everywhere. And don't you know, he panicked when he saw that happening. He probably didn't know what on earth to do. But it looked like this huge machine had exploded into soap bubbles. It looked exactly like a comedy movie. And, I couldn't help but think that it was probably looked a lot like these I Love Lucy, those old movies where she'd get into so much trouble. She would have loved to have had that to use on one of her shows. But even that huge Clearwater rinse compartment filled up with soap bubbles. And so those bottles were supposed to come out on a conveyor belt sparkling clean. That's what it was made for. But every one of them came out so covered with bubbles that you couldn't even see the bottle. It was just a mass of bubbles coming out of the machine. Well, there was so much soap that it peeled all the paint off the machine clear down to the metal, inside and outside. So everything had to be scraped and everything had to be repainted. Well, of course, everybody pounced on poor Hugo because he's the one that had to do all the scraping and all the repainting, and it took a good while for him to do that. And then all of the teasing started up again. And Hugo just went deeper and deeper into self-pity. Now, the guys all teased him. Mr. Ruth wasn't quite as happy about it, what it had done to his machine room. Well, I found out that he had been one of 7 children growing up, and there was nothing wrong with him. Mentally, there was nothing wrong with him, but for some reason, his mother and father had felt sorry for him as a child, and so he picked up on that pity, and it just became a way of life for him, and went clear on into his adulthood. And that way of life plagued him every single day of his existence. It was really sad. Now, there's probably no one who has been totally untouched by this unpleasant enemy called self-pity. And a lot of people operate in self-pity without even realizing it. They don't even know they're operating in it. So we're going to look at some ways now in which we can recognize self-pity in ourselves and recognize it in our children and our grandchildren, because the sweetest thing we can do as a grandparent is help our grandchildren and our children as well to come out of it, because a lot of people tend to go that direction and they need somebody to guide them on the right path, because we're really doing them an unbelievable favor when we do that. But if we can recognize it and stop it early on, we can save them a lifetime of heartache, because I don't think Hugo was ever happy because he just had self-pity all over him. And if we can keep that off of our children and grandchildren, we're doing them a huge favor. So I want us to recognize some obvious earmarks now that characterize self-pity. And I also want us to think of some ways now, some steps for getting set free. Now, sometimes just recognizing it is one of the biggest keys to getting free. Now, I looked up the word self-pity, and this is the definition. Self-pity is a sorrow felt for one's own suffering. It's a sorrow for one's own misfortune, a regret or a sympathy for oneself. That's the definition of self-pity. Now, sometimes the misfortune is real, and sometimes it's imagined, but either way, more misfortune is attracted to us when we stay in self-pity for very long, because it is just like a magnet, you know. So I want you to write some of these characteristics down. Number 1, self-pity will always accompany a victim spirit. If a person's in self-pity, they're going to feel like a victim. For example, if a person has been victimized by anything, it could be rape, it could be sickness, it could be abuse of some kind, or financial disaster, whatever it is. But as long now as that person sees themselves as a victim, self-pity is going to always be there. Now, most people who go through what the world calls middle-age crisis will always find a spirit of self-pity present, or at least that self-pity is knocking at the door. And it may be subtle, but self-pity's there, instigating those subtle mind thoughts. And usually those subtle mind thoughts, they may not even be conscious. They may be subconscious, but they're doing damage. And it'll be thoughts like, well, life's just passing me by, you know. What have I accomplished in life? I can't think of anything I've accomplished. Look what all I've missed out on, you know. There's not much time left, so I'd better get busy and do something fast. Or I'm stuck with a mate who doesn't love me. So forth. You know, you can just name all these self-pity thoughts that come to people's minds. Now, very few people think to look for self-pity. Most of the time, they don't think of the fact that I'm in self-pity. They don't think about that. Anytime there's a middle-age crisis, they just think, well, I'm getting old and things are not going right. But by the time the crisis is recognized, the one going through it, they've already started doing something usually in the natural to try to get rid of it. Sometimes they combat it by going out and buying a new wardrobe, or maybe they'll go and get a new hairdo. So they're trying to fight it, but they're fighting it in the natural. But when it's handled that way, they may look and sound better, but the self-pity is still there, and it's still doing damage. Now, it may be covered over and hidden from the natural eye, but the self-pity is still the culprit, still furnishing all the negative mind thoughts that's causing that person not to be able to accomplish what they need to accomplish, because self-pity is going to hold us back every time. So just a little side note here. Anyone who begins to feel defeated or depressed around the midpoint in life, they need to re-examine their vision. And I'm not talking about their physical vision, but they need to ask themselves, what exactly is my goal? What is it that God wants me to accomplish in life? Is it just to get my bills paid? Is it just so I can finally get to retirement or get a little nest egg? It's not that those are necessarily wrong desires in and of themselves, but if that's all there is to one's vision, then that person is a prime candidate for self-pity and middle-age crisis. And because they don't have any purpose in life. And without a purpose, we're going to get into some self-pity. But the one who keeps God's vision for his life and alive and going, he'll never, and I repeat, he'll never get into middle-age crisis, because he's got his eyes on the Lord. He's got his eyes on something that's eternal. Now, when we're busy with the work of the kingdom, there's no time to dwell then on those negative questions, or because God's keeping us too busy. We don't have time to get to that. Okay, but I want us to move on and think about relationships. There are some areas of flesh that we indulge in now that affect no one but ourselves. And we can't stay in self-pity, though, without affecting every single person in our family. If we're still a child, we'll affect our childhood family. If we're married, we'll still affect our whole family. And it'll eat the other family members alive. Okay, I want you to turn to Luke chapter 15. This is probably no bigger cross to bear than living with a family member who's living in self-pity. So I want us to look at a family situation where self-pity affected every member of the family, including the servants. And in Luke 15, verses 11 and 12, a certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate that falls to me." And he divided the wealth between the 2 sons. Well, the 2 brothers got the same amount, but the younger brother goes off into a life of sin. Now, which would eventually have led to his death, of course. Now, finally, the boy, he's hungry, nothing's working for him, so he repents, and he decides that he'll go home to his father. Now, while he's still a long way off, the Bible says that his father saw him and ran to meet him and had compassion for him, embraced him, kissed him, and the son said, "Father, wait a minute, I've sinned against heaven and I've sinned against you, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Just take me in as a servant. That's all I'm asking for." So he didn't come back in arrogance, He came back in humility. He came back in repentance. So the father gave this big party for him. And number 2, the next character trait of self-pity is always selfishness. Okay, how am I going to be affected? Okay, I want us to look how this reaction hit the older brother. In verse 25 through 28, now his older son was in the field, and when he got through that afternoon and he's approaching the house, he heard all this music and dancing, and so he summons one of the servants, and he said, "What on earth is going on? What's going on here?" And so the servant said, "Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf to celebrate." But he became angry, and he was not willing to come in. And the father had to come out, and he began to entreat him. And he said, "Look, for so many years I've been serving you, and I've done everything you've ever wanted me to, but you've never given me a kid to be married with my friends." Now remember, I said that self-pity is not kept hidden from those with whom we're close. We're going to let them know what we're upset about. And so the older brother feels very sorry for himself, And he lets the father know that he's been mistreated and how unfair this has been. Now, he's not willing to go into the house. He won't even go in where they're dancing and having a good time. But notice, self-pity will always do something to call attention to the injustice that's been done to them. They'll always call attention to that. Because self-pity, one of the things you can remember about it, it's not silent. Now, you may think you're keeping it silent, but it's not. Have you ever seen a child refuse to eat when they think they've been mistreated, even when they're hungry? They're not going to eat because they're mad about something. They're in self-pity about something. Self-pity does that so everyone will take note of how badly they're hurting. You know, unfortunately, this is not just children that do this. I've known wives to cook the food and even serve it, but refuse to eat in protest to some injustice that she thinks been done to her. Or sometimes the husband will even pout and not come to the table because of something he didn't like that's been done. So I want you to think of the irony of that. A spirit of self-pity is indeed a spirit of self-destruct, because why would a person who feels like he's already been mistreated then decide to mistreat himself even more by not eating when he's hungry? You know, he thinks they're mistreating him and he mistreats himself. And they do it in an effort to punish the other person. So it doesn't really make any sense. Self-pity doesn't make sense. Now, it would make a lot more sense if the older brother had just marched in and said, whoa, he's not going to be the only one that has a party. If he had come in and he had eaten and started partying all the more to repay himself for what he thought was due him, that would have been the thing to have done, you know. And the logical thing would have been to think that I'm going to get my share of this party. You know, if they're going to have a party, I deserve it as much as anybody else, and so I'm going to have fun. Why would you punish yourself for an injustice that you thought had been done to you? Why would you punish yourself when you already felt like an injustice had come? So it doesn't make sense, but that's how self-pity operates. It makes you do something bad to yourself because you feel like something's already been done badly to you. Now, so far, we've named rejection, we've named self-rejection, selfishness, we've named hurt, a victim spirit, and self-destruction, and certainly jealousy's there, as well as a spirit of attention. And all this comes as a result of self-pity. Now, I want you to notice in verse 28, the self-pity finally gets the father's attention. Finally, it does. So the father comes out and he begins to beg the older son, come in, son. We're having a party. Come in and be a part. Now, notice that a spirit of self-pity attracts the attention and lacks the attention in a morbid sense. Now, I want you to notice this. It will be attracting a lot of attention to itself, while at the same time, it's going to be telling everybody, go away, leave me alone, I don't want to talk to anybody. But they're doing things to bring attention to themselves. So it's amazing how it works. Have you ever seen that happen? This is a perfect example. The older brother wouldn't come in, but he made sure that the father knew that he was unhappy and got the father to come out so he could tell the father. So I want us to see how self-pity will often manifest in a martyr spirit. That's another clue that you need to put down. In Luke 10:38 through 42, now as they were traveling along, he entered a certain village. This is going to be about Martha. And a woman named Martha welcomed him, and she had a sister called Mary, who was listening to the Lord's word, and she was sitting at the Lord's feet and listening intently. And Martha was distracted with all her preparation because she had been working on the food. And so she comes out to Jesus and she said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the serving, all the work? Please tell her to help me. But the Lord answered, Martha, Martha, you are worried and bothered about so many things, but there's only one thing that's necessary, and Mary has chosen the good part, and it shall not be taken away from her. Ooh, don't you know that bothered that spirit of self-pity that was in Martha when that was said. But this example is probably not a case of chronic self-pity. It may be more of something that happens to all of us from time to time when we think that we've been temporarily mistreated and a lot of work is piled up on us. So I call this one a temporary self-pity attack. But notice that martyr spirit is in Martha. And Martha felt mistreated, she felt abused, and she felt like all the work had fallen on her. And she thought, nobody cares about me. You know, they're having a good time, but they're not caring about me. And I think every woman has experienced this. So what should she have done? Well, she could have decided to go join the rest of the crowd, have fun, and listen to the master and glean from the master. And then, after everybody had heard everything that the Lord had to say, then everybody could pitch in later. When they got hungry, they could have helped her get the food on the table, and they could have helped her. It would have been an easy way to fix it. Self-pity and a martyr spirit keep us acting out the role of a victim every single time. Have you ever seen someone who feels mistreated over having too much dumped on them, and instead of doing what they can and then not worrying about it and just saying, okay, I'm going to do as much as I can, and then I'm going to throw myself into the task of enjoying it with everybody else? But what happens many times, they throw themselves into the task that they put on themselves. No one probably was telling Martha, you have to go in and do all this work. We're listening to the master. But she just felt like, I've got to do all this work. And a lot of times people will do that. They'll get into anger, they'll get into hurt, and they'll get into that self-pity. And sometimes they'll work through the noon hour, they'll work through the dinner hour, and on into the night, trying to make a big ordeal about the fact that they've been unfairly treated. Okay, now let me give you another characteristic of self-pity. Some people don't think of anger as being a companion now of self-pity, but anger and unforgiveness are always involved with self-pity. I want you to realize that someone who has not been forgiven when the spirit of self-pity is operating, sometimes it's self that we haven't forgiven for something, and sometimes it's God that we haven't forgiven. Sometimes there's a root of bitterness there. These are things that you need to check yourself. Okay, let me show you a prime example where anger and bitterness obviously evolved out of self-pity. In Genesis 4, Adam and Eve had two sons, Cain and Abel. They both brought their offerings to God, and God accepted Abel's offering, but he rejected Cain's offering. Well, you can imagine, Cain was very upset about that, and so upset that he finally ended up killing his brother. Now, it's obvious that Cain had a wrong heart attitude. When someone has an humble heart, he gets on his face before God, and he says, Lord, what is there in me that needs to be corrected? And that's where God's wanting us to get. When something happens, rather than running to self-pity and saying, look what's been done to me, after all I've done, God's wanting us to get on our face every single time and say, Lord, what is there in me that needs to change? Because when we do that, God will change us, he'll show us and change us, and life just gets better then. But with Cain, there was no soul searching. There was not any asking God, why was mine not accepted and Abel's offering was accepted? So he wasn't asking God for the reason why he had been refused. Instead, he was just feeling sorry for himself. Oh, poor me, Abel's offering was accepted and mine wasn't. And this was so unfair. That's all he could think, And notice the inner turmoil showed on his face. God said, why are you angry? Why has your countenance fallen? So one of the things that self-pity does, it shows on our face every time. If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desires for you, and you must master it. That needs to be a little quotation that we keep in the back of our mind all the time, that when we're in self-pity, when we're feeling sorry for ourselves, sin is always crouching at the door, and its desire is to pull us down, and God is the one who says, you're the one that has to master it. Now, self-pity always makes itself known. And one way is that it shows on our face. We know this from this example. So we need to check our countenance because it's an open door. Every single time, it's an open door to sin. Now, God is letting us know that when sin is crouching at the door, there are ways that we can recognize it. Number one, we can recognize it because we feel it on the inside. Number two, it can be recognized because of the look on our face. Now, God has ways to let us know when sin is crouching at the door. And God is saying it's sin. Don't put up with it. Master it. Self-pity can become the sin of murder in a heart. Jesus said, if you're angry with your brother, you have murdered him in your heart. That's a pretty strong statement. Now, Cain acted it out, but we can be just as guilty when we think that we've been rejected. And when another person is accepted and we get angry. Okay, that is always a sign of self-pity. Now, self-pity will know no boundaries if it's left unharnessed. Self-pity, jealousy, anger, and finally murder. Okay, let's look at another clue that helps us recognize self-pity. If you'll turn to 1 Kings chapter 19. Elijah has just had this wonderful victory up on Mount Carmel. And he and God have defeated Baal worship, and they have killed 450 prophets of Baal. Then Jezebel, now she evidently wasn't there because she hears about it, she finds out, but she puts the fear on Elijah, and he runs for 40 days and nights and hides in a cave at Mount Horeb. So evidently, she had a witchcraft on her. So evidently, that spirit on her must have been very terrifying, And so he runs. Well, finally, God comes to him in 1 Kings 19, verse 9. And now you've got to realize Jezebel is up north. Elijah, he runs south, and he runs clear down to the Sinai desert. And this, of course, is the desert where the children of Israel crossed over into the Promised Land. And he has run for 40 days to get down there. That's amazing. Well, finally, God comes to him here in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 9. And he said, "What are you doing, Elijah? What are you doing?" And instead of answering God's question and saying, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm in fear and I ran for my life. What a fool I've been." But instead of doing that, instead he begins to justify his actions, and he starts pouring out all this, "Oh, poor me." And in verse 10, he says, "Poor me, look what they've done. Look what they've done. And look what all I've done. I killed all the Baal's prophets. But what good did it do me? Well, it didn't do me one bit of good." Then after a while, in the last part of verse 13, God asked him the same question again. And he said, "Elijah, what are you doing here?" Sometimes God very gently just asks us a simple little question. If we'll listen for those questions, it'll help pull us out of whatever we're going through. And so what does he do? He goes through the whole self-pity spiel again, how badly he's been treated. Now, a person in self-pity always tries to justify his actions. We need to write that down. And a person in self-pity always makes excuses. Now, remember the older brother, if you'll remember, he justified his self-pity behavior in the first example. Then Cain, he justified his self-pity actions. And now Elijah is justifying his self-pity. So there's always a justification that tries to come out of us. Now, we're going to always find ourselves justifying and giving excuses for our bad behavior when we're feeling sorry for ourselves. And something else is a telltale sign here with Elijah's self-pity. Notice he goes over and over his poor me story. He tells it over and over to God. Now, if you think you've been mistreated and you find yourself telling it more than once, look for self-pity. Always look for self-pity. Or if you find yourself telling it to somebody else, look for self-pity. Every person I know who's been victimized by something or by someone and has chosen to stay in that victim role will tell their story over and over, usually to anyone who will listen. They can find an ear, they'll tell it. Well, what if those things are real? Because a lot of people will say, well, what if the pity's justified? What if I have been done really wrong, and I'm justified? What about that? What's the answer for me here? It doesn't matter how real the hurt may be. Doesn't matter how justified we are in the way we feel. As long as we continue to see ourselves as a victim, as long as we do, as long as we stay in that self-pity, we're never going to get healed, ever, Job is a classic example of that. Something in the inside has to change before our circumstances will ever change. There has to be something inside us that changes. And his symptoms were real. He was covered with horrible boils, open sores that oozed all over his body, and it was painful. He was in constant anguish. He was in constant pain, and he got into the depth of self-pity. Now, I can almost sympathize with that. We've all heard at times where, and so you could almost see, but God was trying to pull him out of it. Now, I'm going to just quote a few lines from Job chapter 7 because it's a prime example of what I'm talking about. He began to tell God, "My flesh is clothed with worms and just a crust of dirt's all over me. My skin hardens and runs. My eyes will not again see good. Evidently, it was harming his vision. And he says, therefore, I will not restrain my mouth. In other words, he was saying, I have a right. I'm really hurting and nothing's working. My eyes are not even seeing right. And so I have a right, to feel sorry for myself. He said, I will speak in the anguish of my spirit. In other words, it's true, and I'm going to say it. I'm going to tell about it. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. My bed will comfort me, and my couch will ease my complaint. He said, I'm going to bed. I deserve it, Okay, this is another typical example of what self-pity likes to do. It likes to go to bed and pull the covers up over our head. And I think maybe we might, if we're honest, say we've all done that a time or two, where we think my bed will comfort me. We've all been there. Where we just think, I've got to escape. I can't handle this. And then we find out that Job goes on to say, poor me, why even pray? God's not listening anyway. And a lot of times if a person will be honest, sometimes they think that, God, I've just prayed, I've done everything, and I don't even think you're hearing me, Well, I think maybe we've been too hard on Job's wife. I've thought about that a lot of times. When she said, why don't you just curse God and die? You can almost picture what she's been having to go through. So she probably has heard all the self-pity and all the belly aching that she can take. Now, there have been 30 chapters full of it so far, and self-pity will drive other family members crazy. It really does. And so Job is just fortunate that his wife didn't do the job for him and put him out of his misery. She said, why don't you do it? But it's a wonder she didn't do it. Now, there's hundreds of poor me self-pity statements that we need to watch for. Let me just name a few to watch for. No one cares about me. They always get their way. I never get my way. Nothing ever works for me, no matter how hard I try. I'm never going to trust another person. It just hasn't worked out. I'm never going to trust anybody else. Everybody lets me down. I've tried, and I can't do it anymore. Do you remember the classic self-pity statement that Jonah made when the storm came up and he was at sea? You remember what he said to the sailors? He said, it's all my fault. Just get rid of me, kill me, and all your troubles will be over. That was a self-pity statement. Big time self-pity. Have you ever heard it said, if I die, if I were out of your life, you'd just be better off. You'd be so much better off without me. Listen, don't ever say that. No matter how tempted you are to say it, just put a guard over your mouth. Don't let yourself say that. A person in self-pity wants to tell you how low they are so that you will argue and start bragging on them. That's what they're wanting. They're wanting somebody to say something nice about them. But most of the time, self-pity is so repulsive that no one feels like complimenting that person, They don't want to sympathize with them because they think, this is horrible. I don't even want to be around it. Now, self-pity pretends to hide, but it always will rear its ugly head when it gets into a weakened condition. Now, it's in moments when we're really feeling badly, when we're sick or when we're extremely tired, that self-pity will try to flare up every single time. And a self-pity spirit tries to pull other people in to join ranks with you. It's very seductive and it's very seductive, Okay, now sometimes our self-pity will even cause other people to do wrong things simply because they feel sorry for us. When we're in that self-pity, people will feel sorry for you and it'll cause them to do wrong, to sin. And because self-pity is an enabler. Self-pity is just like the leavening in bread. It spreads and it affects the entire loaf. Okay, now a perfect example of that was the children of Israel when they were going through the wilderness. The murmuring and the complaining spread just like wildfire through 2 million people. Can't you just imagine? They started grumbling and a neighbor heard them grumbling. They said, that's true. This isn't right. And they'll grumble. And it finally came to the point where they all fell into self-pity. And they were feeling so sorry for themselves that they couldn't even see the blessings. They couldn't see the miracles of God, everything that he had done for them, They completely disregarded the blessing and the miracle of the manna. They weren't having to go out and plant crops. God was just pouring manna down for them every day. And instead of being thankful that God didn't let them fend for themselves and die, they just complained. And so Numbers 11 says that the sons of Israel wept bitterly and said, oh, we remember the fish that we had in Egypt. We remember the cucumbers and the melons and the onions and the garlic. It was so good. And now all we have is just this old manna. And that's all they could complain about. That's self-pity. That's self-pity. And when we fail to be thankful for the blessings we have, and we just moan because of what we think we don't have, we've got to realize that's a huge symptom of self-pity. If we want out of it, we better start watching for these earmarks. Now, I've given you a lot of ways to recognize self-pity. So I want to just give you 9 very quick ways to overcome it. Because if we want out of it, we've looked at some ways that are going to show up to let us know it's there. But we need to take some of these suggestions that God gives us in the Word, put them to work, and get free. Now, number 1, in a morbid sort of way, self-pity can feel good to the one that's in it. Now, they're upset about something and they're angry, but it's funny that sometimes it feels good, and the reason is because it's feeding the flesh. Feeding the flesh. Okay, now, so we have to treat self-pity now just exactly like we would treat symptoms of sickness. If you think about it, when you feel like you've got self-pity, treat it like sickness. If sickness hits your body, we've been taught that we don't go by feelings. So we need to recognize, okay, if self-pity's hitting, I can't go by feelings. And we know that with sickness, we've been taught to quote the word on healing and then take authority over the symptoms. The same thing works for self-pity. That takes a little effort because our feelings are hurt. But if we want rid of it badly enough, we'll do it. Okay, do the same thing with self-pity symptoms that you do with sick symptoms. It's fine to say, yes, I have been hurt, and yes, it's very unfair. That's fine to say. We can admit that because it's the truth. But no, I am not going to receive self-pity. I'm not going to give in to my flesh. Flesh brings death, and I'm not going there. We have to make that decision. And sometimes when you're in the middle of self-pity, that's hard because nothing in you wants to go that direction. But if we will, we'll save ourselves. Oh, golly, we'll save ourselves so many problems. Also remember, the battle is in the mind. So sometimes a person will get the victory and they'll come out of the self-pity, but they don't realize the battle's in their mind. So if they turn around later and they start thinking about it and think, well, that really wasn't true. That really wasn't right. What we'll do, we give it permission to come right back in. So once we get rid of it, we're going to have to put up a door, a steel door, and say, no, I'm not letting it back in. Number 2, we have to refuse to allow ourselves to justify the self-pity. There's lots of pain-inspired decisions that come out of self-pity, and none of it brings good fruit. Now, here are some pain-inspired decisions. Let me give you some examples. I'm never going to trust that person again as long as I live. I'm never going to make myself vulnerable again. I opened myself up, and I'll never do that again. I'm never going to trust another preacher ever again. I'm never going to go back to church ever again. Okay, that's called never decisions, and those are all pain-inspired decisions. We need to watch for them, And most of the time we feel very justified because we feel like we've been hurt, and we want the world to know it. A very good example, I didn't have very many good examples of people coming out of self-pity, but one tremendous one, Nathan confronted David with his sin, and David never once tried to justify himself. He just fell on his face, repented totally, and he never went back to it. Okay, number 3, since we saw that anger is often involved in self-pity then, let the anger serve as an alarm signal. It needs to be an alarm signal. Take the misplaced anger and turn that anger on the enemy of self-pity that's trying to destroy you, because it is trying to destroy you. It's not just temporary. It's trying to get to you. Be angry enough to use your authority on the enemy and command it to go. Number 4, watch out for comparisons. In the prodigal son story, the older brother, his whole grievance, came from what had not been done for him versus what was being done for this younger brother that he thought certainly didn't deserve it. Now, self-pity loves to compare when it feels like it's been done wrong. Now, some people compare themselves to somebody else and they fall short, so then they just start feeling sorrier for themselves. They go into more self-pity because they think, oh, I can't believe I did that, or they'll start thinking, I'm just not as smart as so-and-so, or I'm not as good looking, Then there are others, like the older brother, and he looks around and he finds someone who's not behaving as well as he thinks he is. And yet he thinks, well, they didn't behave as well as I did, and yet they're better off because they're getting a big party thrown for them. So they get into self-pity because they think they've gotten a raw deal. And a lot of people go into self-pity because they think, this is just wrong. This is a raw deal. And only God can turn those deals around, but we have to turn it over to Him. Now, if the older brother wanted to compare himself to someone, he should have compared himself to his father. And he should have determined that he was going to be as faithful and as forgiving as his father was. And that should have been his example. Okay, number 5, to get rid of self-pity, you need to start counting your blessings. That's the biggest way to get rid of self-pity. Just start, oh God, I thank you, you've done this, and you've done this, and you've done this, and just start naming it, and it brings self-pity to a halt in a hurry when we force ourselves to begin just meditating on the blessings. Because if we start naming the blessings, boy, it starts multiplying. You start thinking of more and more. And I think it helps to keep a notebook. Start writing down all the blessings that God's done. Okay, number 6, remember that the father told the other brother, we have to rejoice. This boy was dead, and he's alive again. Self-pity does not rejoice with those who are rejoicing because it's too busy having its own private pity party. So to rejoice with someone else forces us outward instead of selfward. Okay, now it wasn't a matter that the older brother was being asked to rejoice with the younger brother. The father didn't come out and say, you need to go in and support your younger brother. He didn't ask him to do that. He was just being asked to rejoice with the father, to share the father's happiness. Okay, number 7. Job came out of his self-pity when he repented and retracted what he was saying. And that's in Job 42, verse 6. Okay, I want you to notice, it's Job 42. That means he's gone through 42 chapters of griping before he finally comes to the place where he repents and takes back what he was saying. So self-pity makes all kinds of bad confessions. So I had to laugh about the fact for 42 chapters, he's saying, I'm going to get in the bed, I'm going to say it because it's true, I'm hurt, I want the world to know it. So can you imagine that poor wife who's gone through 42 chapters of hearing all this? But we have to be open and honest and humble enough then to let God show us where we're wrong and then repent and change what we're saying. We've got to put a guard on our mouth. Put a guard. Okay, number 8. Job prayed for his friends. In other words, he reached out to do something for somebody else. And when he did, the self-pity lifted. Okay, number 9. David was a prime target for self-pity. Saul was trying to kill him. Number 2, he had to hide in caves like an animal. Number 3, at Ziklag, his tents were burned and everything was taken, even his wives and his children. All that was taken. And then, number 4, his so-called friends wanted to stone him. I mean, I can't think of anyone that deserved to be in a little bit of self-pity more than David did. But so he was a prime candidate for self-pity, but instead, it says he ran and he strengthened himself in the Lord. If we want to know how to come out of self-pity, it doesn't matter. We can say all day long, this is unfair. It should not have happened this way. And we can say that. But then we need to run to God and put it in God's hands. And he asked God how to right the problem. So that's our answer. If we didn't say anything else in this Bible study except this one thing, the way you come out of your self-pity is to do exactly what David did. He ran, he strengthened himself in the Lord, and he asked the Lord, what do I do? Show me what to do. Now, self-pity is a self-indulgence. It's a self-centeredness that shuts God out, and it tears down all creativity. Running to God and strengthening ourselves in God is one powerful way to drive off self-pity. But we have to, instead of running into ourself, running into, oh, poor me, we have to run to God and strengthen ourselves in the Lord. And that's exactly what David did. Okay, if you'll just memorize this list, and it'll take you out of self-pity every single time. You have to crucify the flesh. You have to refuse to nurse and rehearse those hurts. No matter how much you want to say it to somebody, you've got to say no. You've got to quit justifying your behavior, even if you have truly been done wrong. You have to turn your anger and that self-pity and drive it away. Determine, I'm not going to receive the anger. I'm not going to receive the self-pity. Then start counting your blessings. And don't just do it one or two. Start naming all the wonderful things God's done for you. And boy, you'll start pulling out of self-pity just doing that. Then you've got to rejoice with those who are being blessed, knowing that your time's going to come. You know, God's going to bless you, especially if you do it right. God's going to start blessing you. Then you have to seek God to see through God's eyes and start cleaning up some of your self-pity statements. Because I promise you, when we're in self-pity, there's things we're saying. We may not be saying it to the world, but we'll have a friend or we'll have somebody that we say these self-pity statements to. We have to see self-pity as sin and repent, because it is. It's a sin. Then we have to reach out to someone else. Okay, now these 9 steps are a surefire method of getting out of self-pity. It'll work. I'm not saying it's easy to go through these 7 steps, but if we do, it will work every single time. And so these are the steps for staying out of it. And we've been looking now at things that will enhance our relationships, but nothing can enhance a relationship any better than refusing to get in self-pity. That's the top thing that we can do for ourselves to cause us to be a good friend and to have friends and people want to be around us, and for that thing to turn around is when we determine in our heart that we're going to refuse to let self-pity move in. Father, we know that self-pity does so much damage. And Lord, it's easy to get into it because most of the time we really feel like we've been done so wrong. But Father, if we'll do what you're telling us to do, just these 9 steps, and put our foot down and say no, Lord, we can make life so much better. We can make life so much better. That's what you're calling on us to do. And as we do it, then we're training other people how to get rid of it. So Father, thank you. Thank you for the truth of your word. In Jesus' name, amen.